What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to Celio's Network. Today I am making an updated tier list for the Pokemon TCG standard format. This is after Toronto Regionals and looking ahead to Arlington Regionals coming up in about a week or two. So we'll be using TrainerHill.com's tier list creator here, and I will be ranking these decks from S tier to D tier. Before that, we do have a word from today's sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by Elestrals, a brand new trading card game currently available on Kickstarter. Before you fast forward because you think this is another generic ad for a boring game, let me stop you there. Elestrals TCG is a passion project that encompasses every good part of a trading card game: collecting, deck building, and gameplay. And so far, it has surpassed my expectations in those categories. And I'm giving Elestrals TCG my personal stamp of approval, judging by everything I've seen so far, including the quality of easy-to-learn yet strategic game design, very customizable decks to meet your playstyle, a transparent line of communication from the creator of the game to the community, and memorable characters and art, like Sluggle, Clovey, and Sonicore, to name a few. The Kickstarter has over 4,000 backers and close to $1 million funded towards the project, and you can join too until December 9th. There are backing options as low as $25 US, which include a starter deck, as well as several extra rewards, which continue to be unlocked as the Kickstarter reaches new goals. Additionally, Elestrals TCG has already begun developing an online TCG app, which will be available in beta access for all Kickstarter backers in 2023. You can use my Kickstarter link below to check it all out, and I highly encourage checking out the tutorials, videos, and more at Elestrals.com. Thanks again to Elestrals for sponsoring today's video. Alrighty, so let's start ranking these decks. S tier is going to be what the meta kind of centralizes around. Now, there's not always an S tier, but in this standard format, we do have an S tier, which is Lugia Archeops. Lugia Archeops is super powerful. It's popular. It's easy enough to play that it can reach really high levels of popularity, but it's also the best deck in format. So Lugia Archeops is 100% a tier S, a tier 0, whatever you want to call it, deck, and we're going to have a meta that centralizes around it. Now, before we get to the part of the meta that centralizes around Lugia, we have tier 1, the next tier down. And these are going to be decks that are inherently good, regardless of Lugia, regardless of everything else. These are just kind of the decks that are good enough, but they're not S tier on their own, because Lugia takes that. So the next tier down, tier 1 or A tier, for me is going to be Palkia and Teleon, keeping in mind Jake Gearhart's list from Toronto Regionals, which adapts around Lugia Archeops. We have Mew Genesect, and this includes Fusion Strike Mew and the DTE Mew. So technically we have two variants here, but this is the overarching deck archetype for Mew VMAX. I think Mew VMAX is super consistent and strong. It's just not as it doesn't have as many variants. It doesn't have as many adaptable cards you can toss in and out of the deck like Lugia Archeops does, and that's what keeps it from being as powerful as Lugia Archeops. And then also in tier 1 or A tier is going to be Lost Zone Box, and Lost Zone Box has a few different kinds of variants to it, but necessarily this is going to be the Kyogre build that we saw Grant Manley, Caleb Gedimer, Azul, and Daniel Davia all do really well with. This past weekend in Toronto, you could check out those deck lists at limitlesstcg.com. And this can also include the Sableye Charizard builds, but those aren't doing as well right now. But that's going to be my tier 1. So we have S tier, which the meta centralizes around. Tier 1, which is the decks that you're going to also keep in mind, but they're not as important as Lugia Archeops. And then let's move down into the B tier. The B tier are going to be decks that are functional, they're solid, but are they good enough to stand up to these top 4 decks? Or they also might be in the B tier or tier 2. They might also be here because they're good enough to counter some of these decks, and that counter meta is a factor bringing them higher up into the tier list than I would typically put them. So I do think Giratina Lost Zone Box is right now just under regular Lost Zone Box, so we are going to put it here. Not because it counters anything, not because it interacts with the meta in any way, but I think inherently it's this good of a deck right now. I think it's better to just play Lost Zone Box without the Giratina at the moment, but Giratina is still a good deck. You know, it's still in the top 10 decks in my opinion. It just doesn't crack into the tier 1 for me. And then we're also going to have Frostmoth and Teleon Box be in this next tier down. Now, Frostmoth and Teleon Box won the Melbourne regionals, I believe, or was it Brisbane? I called it Brisbane and it was Melbourne, or it was the other way around, but it was in Australia for sure. The Frostmoth and Teleon box won, and I have a video on the channel if you want to check it out for a whole deck profile and gameplay with this deck. Um, so I think this is a counter meta deck that can also find itself existing in the format outside of just that one event. I also think Control finds itself in here. So now Control is, these are both essentially the same deck. Mewtwo Control, Yveltal Control. Not the same deck, but, you know, they're both Control. One's going to have Mewtwo V-Union, one doesn't. That's the main difference, but they're both Control. They're both using a very, very similar strategy. And in my opinion, Control is as good as the deck builders are, because if the person building Mewtwo Control or Yveltal Control, if the group building a Control deck can evaluate where the holes and the weaknesses are in the format, then Control can succeed at some level. So I put Control here because it's not it's not Lugia Archeops, which is pretty easy to pick up and do well with, and it will be super popular all the time. It's not necessarily here in tier 1 with the decks that have cemented themselves as solid meta decks, so it's right underneath here. And if players can figure out what to do with it, like we've seen Sander Wojcik do, like we saw Piper Lapine do, then it can succeed. It can win events. And then we're also going to put Reggie here in B tier because Reggie's is solid. It's not as good as it was in Lost Origin format, but it's definitely solid. And now moving down on to C tier, we have decks that are just a little bit under these B tier decks. So we have Arceus Duraludon. It's pretty good. It doesn't have a lot of player agency. It's not super popular. It's a known quantity though, and players can tech for it. Lugia can tech for it with Lost Vacuums. Mew VMAX can tech for it with Echoing Horn. It's very, very beatable. We're also going to put Kyurem Palkia down here. Kyurem Palkia is a solid functioning deck, but it's just not very impressive amongst the other ones. Now, you might be asking, does Frostmoth and Teleon Box really deserve to be above Kyurem Palkia and Arceus Duraludon? I think because of the current counter strategies that it provides, I do think it deserves to be up here. I think this deserves to be a deck that people are thinking about. You know, Lugia is going to be thinking about this kind of deck going into Arlington. Lugia is going to be thinking about Jake Gearhart's version of Palkia going into Arlington. And this deck is actually good enough to take on the rest of the meta, I believe. Now, a deck that is not good enough to take on the rest of the meta, I think, would be the Flaffy box that got second to the Frostmoth box. I have not been impressed with this Flaffy deck. I've spent hours and hours trying to get gameplay for videos with this deck, and I've been less than impressed by it, and I feel like this deck was just in the right place at the right time, and I do not expect it to continue to see success. Someone can feel free to prove me wrong on that. Durant, I feel similar about, right place at the right time. I don't think it's actually that good. Vikavolt decks in general, we're going to put here in C tier because I do think they're good enough, but I don't think they're as good as any of the decks above them. Inteleon box, I think, is better than it's being given credit for. I think it's being severely underplayed because people are afraid of Lost City, or they think that the Lost Zone is just automatically always better than Inteleon box, but I think Inteleon box is being underplayed, so I'm going to put it right here. And then the last one is Arceus and Teleon, which is obviously S tier, just kidding. But Arceus and Teleon, this can also include Arceus and Teleon Beedrill, I think is another very underplayed deck. Um, I think it's better than all the decks in C tier, but I don't want to put it up into B tier since really I'm the only one talking about it. It doesn't have any popularity. It doesn't really have meta relevance yet. I know that it can beat most of these decks. Um, but I think I'll just leave it here for now. A little bit more popularity, a little bit more presence in the meta, and it can easily move up to here with Frostmoth box, but we'll do that. And then I'll also order the decks while we're at it. Um, so I think this is the ordering for A tier. I think Frostmoth box should be lower than Tina. I think Reggie should be above Inteleon box. I think these should be under control. And then that is the ordering for all the other tiers. So that is my updated tier list right now for the standard format of the Pokemon trading card game. And thanks to Trainer Hill for making this new tier list creator. It's pretty nifty. So thank you guys for watching. Also, shout out to Elestrals TCG again for sponsoring today's video. And I'll see you next time here on Celio's Network.